So final deputation request this morning is in respect of item 7.1 on the agenda, the report on the empty homes update, and it's a request from the Buckstone Association. Some supporting information from the deputation was emailed to members yesterday, and the committee are asked to agree to hear the deputation. So, Convener, we have Mr and Mrs Gray on behalf of Buckstone Association and supported by local ward member Cllr Scott Arthur.
Okay, welcome. As with the other ones, 10 minutes, and then we'll try very hard for 10 minutes of questions.
I've just got something that's probably easier if I just read it out, I think. I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to speak today on this. My husband and I have lived in Buckstone for 32 years. I'm here as a representative of the Bucks Association who are happy that I speak on their behalf. I want to explain to you how the abandonment of the property next door to us for the last 20 years has really impacted on us as direct neighbours and also the main Buckstone Association. The property in Buckstone has been completely abandoned since the current owner inherited the property 20 years ago. The person who inherited the property hasn't lived in it for over 30 years, and since inheriting the property has completely failed to take any responsibility for it whatsoever. It's fallen into total disrepair. The last action taken by the council against the owner was some 10 years ago, and at the point of recovery action by the council, the owner undertook to keep everything going, renovate the property, let it out, and basically fulfil his obligations to the council and the wider community. Unfortunately, absolutely no renovations took place. The property's just got worse and worse, and the owner's never returned to the property since that time. I think you've seen photos that Scott circulated yesterday. We've got them here. As far as the condition of the property goes, this is where the abandonment has actually had the most severe impact on the whole neighbourhood, and particularly us as close as neighbours. The property deteriorated significantly over 20 years. Nearly all the windows are now boarded up. These are regularly removed by intruders on the property, pulled off, blown off, falling to bits. The police are constantly having to be harassed to actually reboard it. The council won't reboard it. The police don't want to put the money out to reboard it. The property is actually very dangerous because there's broken windows behind the panelling. In one case, fairly recently, there's big patio doors. The wood was torn off by, again, intruders. There was broken glass behind. Now, anyone putting their hands through these windows to try and see what was happening could have easily torn their wrists to bits. The council actually served a statutory notice 10 years ago in relation to the ongoing maintenance of the property. Again, this is when there was action taken. That's not been complied with, despite the statutory notice clearly stating that it was the garden and the property were to be maintained, and it would be a criminal offence if you didn't. That's been ignored, not followed through by the council. As well as the impact looking at this property every day, it attracts undesirables to the area. There's been lots of issues in Buckstone over the last few months of burglaries and various other antisocial behaviours. Pardon? Car vandalism and things like this. Our property actually has a side window. It's right onto this property, and we're constantly, you're sitting at night and there's shadows walking past your windows, like 6 feet from your window. We've called the police on numerous occasions. We've actually stopped doing so because they either don't come out because it's not important, or if they do eventually come out, it's too late. There have been numerous times there's been intruders on the property. If we challenge people during the day, depending on who it is, if you see someone walking down, we'll maybe say, oh, can we help you? Depending on who it is. But I mean, generally, if there's a gang of youth standing outside your door, you're not going to challenge them. And we do actually feel very threatened living in the property with this next door. The garden's so overgrown now that people can hide in the property. They go in the property, they go in the garden. There's a greenhouse in the garden that you can't even see in the photos now, and it's completely broken. So again, anyone in the property, the police won't even go in the back garden now. They said it's too dangerous. They won't go in the property, they won't go in the garden. A while back, another window was boarded up, and Stuart, my husband, went in just to check that it hadn't been pulled off again, and we found a sword that size in the back garden. And I mean that size. The guy's into martial arts. And they found a sword that size that someone had removed from the property and then presumably had gone, oh good, and put it back. So I'll not tell you what the police said when they came and found it, but they needed a rather bigger sword tube for it. There's a lot been fly tipping in the property. Someone even, it was double glazing windows. They just dumped a whole lot of windows in the front garden. There's people dumping rubbish. There's booze bottles in the back garden. You can actually access, I don't know if you probably could now because it's so overgrown, but there's woods at the back on the golf course and the Braid Hill, Blackford Hill, and people could technically get through into the woods. I don't know if they were coming back and forward, but there were certainly bottles of booze. There's a huge amount of cigarette ends, like masses, and it might not just be cigarette ends, I don't know. But there's certainly a lot of kids. I mean, there's a lot of youth, but my main concern is the youth from the primary school, the kids. You get 5-year-olds, 10-year-olds. They call it the haunted house, I believe. They all come in the garden, you see them running down, and usually bang on the window and they just run off. But if they go in the back garden, someone is going to be seriously hurt. The council have been aware of this property for 20 years. I've had 20 years of meetings with MPs, MSPs, lots of councils. I've got dozens of emails. The council have told me that it doesn't pose any more a risk to the estate than any other property. Now, there's a garage with, I believe, a car and a freezer in it. Yep. The plants against the boundary wall is a garage, and the harling is all falling off big chunks into our garden, which is really nice, you know. But all the plants have died off on that wall. Suddenly they've all gone black, so I don't know what's in that garage. It's leaching through into our garden. There's a shed with old rusty equipment. There was a wall that's fallen down. There was big nails like that, which I think you've trampled down over the years. But, you know, it is an absolute danger, and the council have been well aware of it for 20 years. So I don't know what would be the position if someone really badly hurts himself. And as I said, the police won't even go on to it. The fire brigade have told us it's a fire risk. The police have told us it's a fire risk. You know, the owner's not going to do anything about the property unless he's forced to do so. He's clearly abdicated all responsibility for the property. You'll see again from the photos, before it was boarded up, we took pictures through the window because it was wide open. There'd been a blanket put down so the intruders could easily get in and out. The kids were using it easily before it was broken down. There's a dishwasher full of dirty dishes. There's food sitting out. I mean, the house has just basically been abandoned. I mean, it must be absolutely hoaching inside. And I don't know what the intruders have been up to. I've no idea what the kids have been doing in there, when they've been in there, so I don't know what state it could possibly be inside. We've asked, again, the police about making the property secure. No one really wants to board it up properly. And the police told us that we should get security lighting on it and board it up ourselves, as you know, our personal expense, which is completely not acceptable. It's also the ongoing cost of the taxpayer, our time, Scott's time, previous councillors' time, police, fire brigade, you know, various visits from council officials. This property is costing an absolute fortune to the council. Really, you know, as I said, we've regularly corresponded for 20 years with numerous council officials, MPs, MSPs. There's been all sorts of promises about action being taken. There seems just too many people within the council all doing their own little bits. You know, one person looking at one thing, one's looking at someone else. Really what it needs is someone to take responsibility for the whole thing. You know, we brought Scott on board here after he was elected, and we do appreciate, you know, that you've been trying to, again, move further forward. The owner has clearly got no intention and actively avoids taking any responsibility for the property. He's made undertakings to the council to renovate it, let it out, hasn't done anything. He won't do anything without being forced to do so. I know that empty homes are a big thing at the moment with the council, the government, and obviously anything you can do to increase housing stock. And while obviously that's not a social housing property, surely any property that's brought back into use filters down the housing chain and becomes a house for somebody at some point. So really, I think why we're here today is really just to point out is what the impact of living next to these houses really has on the area. I mean, we're constantly being asked, you know, you're out in the garden, it's a nightmare. I'm going to get a flyer. You know, because people just constantly stop you and say, why are the council not doing anything? And I think the compulsory purchase seems to be the only way the council would progress anything with this property. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Do we have any questions? No? Oh, Councillor Lang.
Thank you, and thank you for your deputation. You talked about some of the particular action which the council took, I think, a little bit more historically. More recently, what is it that council officials, this may be one for Scott as well, what is it that council officials have said to you would be the realistic available options within the council's power to try and address the problem?
Yeah, okay, if you want to say a couple of words, but very briefly, because we have had our 10 minutes.
I appreciate that. So I'll come to the question you raised, actually, Kevin. Thanks for that. And thanks for listening to both myself and, more importantly, Mr and Mrs Gray. First of all, I have to say there's a slight conflict of interest here because I live just 277 metres from the house. 277, yeah. From the house that Mrs Gray has just described. Thankfully, I can't see it from where I live, though. I used to live on the same street as the house up until around 2010, and I would quite often go past the house from my kids, when my kids were much younger, going to the shops or going to nursery or whatever, and I used to joke that it was a haunted house, and the kids played part in that game. But it was only once I was elected that I saw the direct impact it has on the people living immediately adjacent to it. I think all the problems that Mrs Gray's has explained. I think it's a blight on the wider neighbourhood. It's a danger, to people who enter the building. There is a risk, because the windows are boarded up, there is a risk if the child was to go inside and have an accident. How long would they lie there before being discovered? There's also the fire risk as well, which I think Mrs Gray has explained. It's a draw on both the council resources, police resources, and also the fire brigade. And I think you can tell from the testimony that Mrs Gray's made as well, it also has impact on the well-being of the people who live around it, because it is something that they do worry about. And I know Mrs Gray, before she goes on holiday, she thinks about it. When she's on holiday, she thinks about it. When she comes back, she thinks about it. So I think if we are talking about prioritising these empty homes, abandoned homes across the city, these are the kind of things we have to think about. We have to think about the impact on the community, but also the cost to the council and the wider services in the city. So it has been empty for 20 years. I think my predecessors, Councillor Daphne Slay and also Elaine Aitken, I think they did tremendous work trying to progress this, and I think they did make a great deal of progress, but they never quite made it. I think since I've been elected, speaking to different council officers, I could see individual officers were actually working quite hard on this, actually pulling together data and trying to progress it. But it was kind of like a machine where the gears were all turning quite fast, but they weren't really connecting together, if I can use that analogy. I think recently we had Gareth Barwell out to look at the garden, Councillor Camaday, the council deputy leader, he came out, spoke to Mrs Gray as well. But I think what's changed things is Gillian Donoghue, who's in the gallery just now, she came out and spoke to Mrs Gray and myself, and she's managed to get these wheels to work a little bit closer together. And I think that's what you see in the proposals here today, is the proposal to use the compulsory purchase order for properties like this, and let's hope that this one is one of the first few that go forward into the trial to try and address this. The alternative the council could do is to repossess the property. There's issues there because the owner of that particular property is hard to locate, and that's a barrier in the process. Separate to this, I understand that there's an ongoing debt recovery action against the owner, and a bank is quite aggressively pursuing that in the courts. But it has been before the court repeatedly, even in the last year since I've been elected, but no action's taken. It's continued repeatedly because the owner can't be traced. The only power the council has, which the bank does not have, is a compulsory purchase power. These powers are used elsewhere in Scotland to great effect, and I understand are used extensively in England to recover properties like this. So I think it's really I really do encourage this committee to support the idea of dealing with these really problematic properties by using compulsory purchase powers. Thank you. And I hope that answers your question, Kevin.
Thank you, Councillor Arthur. Are there any other questions for the deputation? Councillor Ray?
I just wanted to thank you for your deputation and congratulate you on your patience. I genuinely don't think I would have managed to go that long without taking action myself. Thank you.
I mean, we were on the point of going to the press about it 10 years ago. And that's when the council took action 10 years ago. And I must admit, it's... I've lost patience, to be honest. We've had so many promises over the years. And there are other issues that we think the council could be going along, but they won't.
Okay, thank you. Oh, Councillor Work.
It was just a point of clarity. I'd be like to ask officers questions because on this.
So we will be taking the agenda item next.
Yeah. Sorry?
We'll be taking the agenda item next, at which point you can ask officers questions. So, okay, thank you very much. I said we're going to take the agenda item next, but I think we should take a 5-minute break if that's okay with everyone. Yep, we're back. Okay, welcome back. We'll move straight to 7.1.
Item 7.1 on the agenda is a report by the Executive Director of Place, providing an update on empty homes. We have a coalition motion, a Green Group addendum and a Lib Dem Group amendment circulated.
Elaine, are you going to speak to this? Thank you.
Hello. I'll introduce the Empty Homes report. This report provides information for committee on our ongoing work to bring empty homes back into use. The focus of our empty homes work is very much in relation to long-term empty homes, and particularly where they're having the impact on local neighbours and the immediate community. And the deputation we've just heard from earlier really highlights the impact that a long-term problematic empty home can have. Most of today's report focuses on our plans to pilot the use of CPOs in relation to some problematic homes. And what I would propose to do, I've asked my colleague Gillian Donohoe to join us for this item because Gillian has been leading in relation to developing our work around piloting use of CPOs for empty homes, and so that we can explore how we would take forward that work.
Gillian, did you want to add anything to that? Okay. Are there any questions? Lots of questions. Councillor Munro.
Yeah. Right. Thanks very much. And given the power of the deputation and given the length and the history behind this, could we look at utilising the powers that are being sought here to actually try and tackle this problem? Because there's multiple agencies involved here. You know, if you're talking about a garden that the police are too scared to go in, then we've got an issue, you know. And yet we're actually quite generous in our contribution to the additionality that Police Scotland are supposed to bring. So I might have thought they might have sent in a SWAT team, you know. But I also think that there is a bigger issue here. This will not be just this property, but the symbolism of this property and tackling it is actually probably quite a good one. And I think we should also be thinking about retrospectively billing whoever is the owner of this for the agency work that's been involved to date. Because again, I think that there's an issue there, and I think we should also be looking at what's happened with the rates regarding this property, so that we take a holistic look at the property if we're looking to purchase it, and deducting full costs to public services that have been involved in trying to tackle the issues by this negligent owner. Would that be part and parcel of the process that we're looking to do here, Elaine?
My understanding is there's provisions where council tax that is due for a property, there's recovery processes that can come into play in relation to that as you move through that process. Less clear in relation to other work and costs that there might be associated with dealing with impact in relation to an empty home in the type of scenario that we've heard today.
So we have various amendments which will culminate in a further report coming, so perhaps that's something that we could get a bit more information on in that report. That's a good point, and I'll add that into the amendment. Did you have a follow-up question?
Yeah, just can this one be at the top of the list for this particular strategy? This property that we've been discussing this morning, could it be one of the ones at the top of the list that we look at doing first of all?
I think we're not going to be discussing individual properties, and it's not for committee to decide. That would be an officer decision based on, I mean, we haven't got all of the evidence and on all of the properties. We don't know what they are and we don't know what the criteria are. So I think that's something that I would prefer that we leave to officers. I have Councillor Work next.
Thanks, Convener. I was involved with the Empty Homes Task Force, I think it was called, in the last administration, and I was aware of a lot of the good work that the council did in getting quite a lot of these long-standing homes back on the market. But that required the cooperation of the owners, and I think we obviously have difficulties when we can't either contact the owners or get the cooperation. And so I suppose the question is, I can't remember if compulsory purchase orders, but it was discussed that time. I think the remit of our group was to concentrate on what we could do with the homes. And I just wondered, I mean, I would support this going forward, you know, if that's what we're going to concentrate on but I wonder why we didn't maybe discuss the compulsory purchase orders the last time. And maybe it was because we were concentrating on what we can do easily.
I wasn't involved at that time, so I couldn't. I don't know why compulsory purchase orders wouldn't really have been discussed at that particular time. In terms of engagement with owners and tracing owners, you're absolutely right. That's one of the major challenges in this work, and the case officers who are working on it, that's a big part of their workload, just trying to trace owners and then providing information, advice, linking with other services to deal with the impacts of an empty home on the community.
Councillor Rose.
Thank you, Convener. Notwithstanding the history of the particular case that we've heard about from the deputation and what we've heard from Cllr Arthur, Mr and Mrs Gray, can you confirm that, according to paragraph 3.3, we have 34 empty homes on the caseload? Is this one of them? That's my first question, then I've got a second one. Is this, in other words, is this currently on that caseload that's referred?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Thank you very much. My second question relates to paragraph 3.4, where it talks about 27 empty homes being brought back into use. Can I just be absolutely clear that those 27 that we're talking about have been brought back into use substantially because of the work of the PRS team? In other words, the council's activity, or are we just saying that that happens to be the number of those that have been brought back into use over the last year?
It's probably a mixture, to be honest, because they are tracking their active cases and then checking when they've closed. Sometimes contact from the private rented sector officers will be enough to instigate some action, and then a further few months down the line, that property may end up being on the market. So you could say that there is an intervention there, even if it's been quite limited, but it's not always easy to make that direct correlation. But certainly the work that they're trying to do is around their active caseload. They are constantly trying to trace owners. In a number of those cases, they haven't managed to do that yet, so there isn't really the ability to kind of bring back into use directly. I think these are the closed cases. That's what we reported to the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership. That's where those figures come from. They do an annual report which pulls together figures from across the country. There's probably slightly different ways of interpreting that, but we chose to interpret it as the ones we knew had been on our active caseload and no longer were on the active caseload, many of which would have had some sort of intervention from officers in the interim. Others may, just by coincidence, have been put onto the market, but at some case probably had been, had received a letter from our officers saying, have you got any intention to do anything with this home? We've noticed it's empty. We generally take that approach initially, encouraging people, and then a lot of the caseload at the moment is around the more complex cases like what we've heard about this morning.
So that's very interesting information. Out of 1,267 properties, there's only movement in 27, which, if I'm not mistaken, is a tiny, tiny percentage. Thanks.
The caseload is the ones that we're aware of, where people have come to the council directly, an elected member, a member of the public, or another council officer has perhaps brought it to their attention. So we're actively aware that these ones are causing some sort of issue. The ones that are empty, 1,267, a number of these may not even be visibly empty. They may not be causing any issues. The owners are probably paying their council tax. So we haven't had an approach where we've concentrated on those. We've concentrated on the ones where we know that issues have arisen for neighbours and the wider community.
Thank you, Convener.
Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Convener. I'm just keen to improve my understanding a little bit of the legal and the financial implications of compulsory purchase orders. So in 5.1 and 5.2, there's some discussion about what the cost of pursuing a compulsory purchase order might be. I understand that there will be some uncertainty about that until you actually proceed with the process. But can you give an order of magnitude figure? Because the report seems to suggest quite a lot of capital would have to be tied up to pursue a compulsory purchase order. Are we talking of sums that are potentially greater than the sale value of, or potentially greater than the value of the property that would have to be tied up and held in escrow while the legal process is ran through and potentially for some time afterwards?
I think part of the reason we're piloting this is to allow a proper assessment of the costs, both in terms of officer times and the time required to provide evidence, to provide the detailed information that's often required, and often the sort of back and forth there is in cases like this. So the direct legal costs will not be, and I don't anticipate that the total cost would be over the value of the actual property itself. But there is a bit of work to be done here to just estimate, particularly in officer time, what time is involved, what the cost of that is, particularly related to the outcomes here as well. So, and that's part of the reason for doing it as a pilot. I think we could say we're not talking about costs that would be in excess of the value of property, but there's a significant time and costs involved in this, some of which I think can be reclaimed in the overall costs of the action, some of which won't, and it's the officer time and resource which is important.
So thank you for that. So just really, again, by way of a follow-up and to help my understanding, I take it the option of compulsory purchase order is being considered when other options for recovering debt don't present themselves. So what is it that prevents us just trying to recover debt for properties perhaps where there's outstanding council tax and trying to ensure best value that way?
I think on a number of these properties, the outstanding debt isn't the principal issue in terms of the impact that it's having on communities. So separate action can be taken to continue to try and do that. And there are ways that the council can protect its interests, but perhaps they aren't actually going to be able to recoup some of that money until the property is either repossessed by a bank, perhaps, or through the CPO process. So I think it's, for some of these very complex ones, it's when you've reached a point where the owner of the property isn't actually responding to any of the letters and things that they receive, or we actually don't know where they are. So it's very difficult to even have that discussion with them. So.
Councillor Lang, then Councillor Ray.
Thank you, Convener. My impression of this issue is that there are almost two kinds of empty homes here. You've got the kind which could count for a lot of these, where it's probably more on the help and support side for owners. I don't think we should lose sight of that, because I think that comes back to Councillor Rose's point around the bulk of these and how you try to get movement on those. And then you've got the kinds of issues that were brought up in the deputation, which becomes more around enforcement. On the CPO point, because I'm conscious that a lot of the frustration comes in because these things have been going on for a long time. On the CPO point, when do you what timetable have you got in mind in terms of being able to bring the business cases to F&R in the first instance?
Firstly, I think in terms, I'll answer your question, but firstly, in terms of the point you were making around empty homes, you're absolutely right that there is different types of empty homes, and in terms of a lot of homes in the kind of housing market that we are operating in, where there is real financial incentive for owners to either sell their homes or indeed to put their homes into the rented market, there is an element of information and advice, making sure that's out there so that people are aware that those options are around, and indeed then, of course, our focus being on these longer term ones where they are causing the impact in terms of residents. In relation to taking forward the financial business case, we've been working in terms of being able to do that at the start of the new year.
Councillor Ray.
Thank you, Convener. The figures that are in the report, the 1,267 empty homes in Edinburgh, which is a very high figure, is actually the figure presented by the Council, whereas the figure presented by the Scottish Empty Homes Partnership, which takes as its basis any home that's empty for more than 6 months, is actually 5,046. So in Edinburgh, we have more empty homes than anywhere else in Scotland. And while I'm very happy to see that further action is being taken and that we're moving forward on it, would the officers consider that having a dedicated member of staff, particularly now we're going down the route of CPO, would actually be beneficial in this case to perhaps speed up the process and streamline the process?
I think the issue about the overall numbers of empty homes, and there are different, maybe bring Elaine and Gillian could say, immersed in the detail of different ways of counting the number of empty homes. But yes, however they're counted, there will be a large number in Edinburgh because Edinburgh is one of the largest authorities. When you look at the proportion of empty homes, the proportion of empty homes sits somewhere in the middle of authorities. It's important to see the context of this. The other point, I think, maybe drawn out from what Elaine was discussing, is that in this housing market, the incentives for people to bring forward empty homes are different from, say, North Lanarkshire, who I think are one of the authorities of a much higher turnover than we have throughput, because there isn't a housing market in some of those areas in North Lanarkshire. So housing associations and councils can buy them up at reasonable cost and turn them into social rent. That's broadly what happens. The difficulty we have here is that most empty homes, if we bring them forward, and I think you'll see from the report stats, will move into the private market because that's where there is a much more, I could say buoyant, I know it's a different term, but certainly a market for them. So the outcomes here are quite challenging. So there's quite a significant amount of officer time here to deliver what is sometimes a fairly low impact option. Really. So the numbers are, yes, they're high, but proportionately they're in the middle of the sort of local authority range.
Do you want to follow?
Sorry, the other point was also about the dedicated officer, and what we've tried to do in recognising that there are a number of teams that are involved in this across the council is that Gillian's role, a significant part of Gillian's role, is to coordinate that activity across the regulatory services, finance, so that we have the risk of going for just one dedicated officer is that the casework lands on one person and the integration with teams gets lost. So a lot of Gillian's work over the last year and a half has been into building up the casework team in regulatory services, developing the links and making sure that the council tax work is integrated, and also the support that we need from legal services. That's a considerable staff resource, and I think that the approach that we've taken has been to develop that integrated team approach. There's probably a bit of work to be done, referring back to one of the other points that was raised about the impact on local areas of empty homes, about the sort of local liaison with police, fire and other agencies. But we've very much taken an integrated approach, led by Gillian, but with quite a lot of senior staff and frontline staff input and dedicated to this.
Councillor Ray.
I just wanted to come back and say that, personally speaking, as a councillor from the City of Edinburgh, I'm not happy being in the middle. In the middle's not a good place to be. I want to be at the top. I want to be achieving more for our city, not being in the middle. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Ray seems to have sparked off some other questions. So, Councillor McClellan.
Thank you. Just to clarify, compulsory purchase orders is not necessarily a silver bullet in conditions that we just saw, which are admittedly shocking, and that in that, just to confirm that in those circumstances, a compulsory purchase order would still mean the council having to pay the market value for that home. And that home, even in its dilapidated state, is still probably going to recoup something like £350,000–400,000, which the council would have to pay, then remarket it. So actually the margins in buying that property and then putting it back on the market actually could be quite small for the council, and no guarantee of recouping the outstanding council tax and things like that. So compulsory purchase orders might, on the face of it, appear like an ideal opportunity to solve a local problem, but actually could leave the council with a significant financial exposure.
And you're right, the margins would be tight. No, there's no easy solution to this. The costs are likely to be high, but the business cases that would go forward to finance and resources would set out how we would seek to recoup those costs and any anticipated resale. But that's why we are proposing to do this as a pilot, so that we can then review and report back to committee on these issues.
Okay, Councillor Burgess.
Thanks very much for the report. I was struck with the earlier questioning and answer. The portfolio that we're working on is 34 properties, I think, out of the 1,267 or the 5,000, however, which way you want to count it. I'm aware that in the last 2 years in Glasgow, 400 properties, empty homes, have been brought back into use, and in Stirling 129 in the last 2 years. Stirling's obviously a bit smaller than Edinburgh. So it comes back to the question about whether it would be useful to have a dedicated officer to pursue this in Edinburgh, as they do in many other councils. And I think that's what, I know we're going to get on to addendums and amendments later, but just to say, I think that's what the bottom line of the Green Amendment is pointing at. If we could look into that a bit further and see if that might help. And, the CPO, it does seem like it'd be a useful tool to have for officers to have in the cases that we've heard about. And I do wonder, there was a comment that it might have been helpful if there was somebody who was dedicated, had an oversight of the issue continually. That might have brought things to a fore quicker. So, maybe that's something that could be considered. Sorry, and turn that into a question. Is that the correct understanding about other councils?
Sorry, could you repeat the final part of your question?
Yeah, it was sort of the first. The general question is, my understanding is that if you compare Edinburgh to other councils, in terms of the numbers, the volume of empty homes that are being brought in, we're not achieving as much as other councils. And
yeah, just a comment on that.
I think other councils take quite different approaches in many ways, depending on the nature of the problem. And I think the collection that the Empty Homes Partnership do annually asks these kind of questions, but I'm not sure how people interpret them when they're responding. And my feeling from reading some of the stuff around Glasgow, for example, is that their empty homes work is very much linked to sort of wider regeneration activity as well. So they do have empty homes officer work involved in that, so it might be slightly different from ours. So it's difficult to comment because I don't know exactly what they've returned. But just to bear in mind that, you know, it's a general question that goes out to all local authorities who may interpret it slightly differently.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Burgess?
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate there'll be difficulties in making comparisons because of the different ways of counting, but I suppose hundreds are different from tens, you know, and that's quite a lot to be a difference down to just counting. So, I'm just keen to, keep pursuing ways in which we can improve our council's performance on empty homes.
Sorry, if I you mentioned Glasgow, which has several hundred properties brought back into use. My understanding of that is that some of those, quite a lot of those, will be brought back into use by housing associations using considerable amounts of housing association grant in regeneration areas. So in Govan Hill, for example, there's very specific programmes, regeneration programmes there, and elsewhere in Glasgow where there are homes for which there isn't a market demand, but which are then returned into housing association houses. Those conditions are just very different from what they are in Edinburgh. And we can try and do a bit more work and maybe pick out 2 or 3 of these other authorities that have a higher number and maybe give a bit of analysis for members in the briefing about what those market conditions are and what those other interventions are.
I don't think there's any more questions. Yeah. Oh, sorry, Councillor Cameron.
Thank you, Convener. Briefly, question. So, following up from the point that Councillor McClelland made in terms of what margin might be available with CPOs, I mean, depending on the property, there could be profit if it was a house on a significant piece of ground that could be sold to develop for apartment. You know what I mean? There could be. So, we shouldn't just presume, and that should be explored by officers. I suppose my question to officers, in terms of the number of empty homes, do you have a handle on, and is it a difficult thing to find out if you don't, how many of those properties are former council-owned homes? And I ask that because from our issues in managing blocks where we've got some private, some council, and we've got a strategy and a policy around that, would that be a possible priority, or be one of the criterion, I should say, in terms of what might be developing the list in terms of which properties go into the pilot? Also, on the report, under 9.1 and 9.2, where it talks about the council being represented regarding this new CSO power, which is also referred to in paragraph 318, the remarks about it could be some time before the CSO becomes an option. Is there any indication of timescale, and are representatives, particularly from our council, on that group pushing the urgency because it seems like a good idea to have a CSO as well as a CPO option, because in Edinburgh, which is where we all are, and I agree with the remarks Councillor Ray made about it's not good enough for the capital city to be in the middle, are our representatives on these groups pushing the Edinburgh case and pushing the urgency on our behalf as elected members? Thank you.
I'll answer the first bit of the question, if you don't mind. In terms of former council homes, I don't know that we have a really good grasp on that in terms of the overall picture across the city. It's something we could try to look at using the data that we can get from council tax, although it's quite difficult to manipulate some of that into the way that you want to do it. However, I do know in the last few years that we did purchase an empty home through our acquisition and disposal strategy, and in fact I think that's the only one that's been brought back into use as a social rented home through that. So where those two things coincide, and then if an empty home was to meet the criteria for our acquisitions strategy, we'd certainly look at that, but I'm happy to have a more proactive look at that as well.
I can maybe cover the second point in relation to compulsory sales orders. Scottish Government asked the Land Commission to look at developing the proposals around introducing compulsory sales orders. So they brought together an advisory group, and the advisory group met on 3 occasions, and I attended that meeting. The compulsory sales order potentially, and shelter was represented on this group, and links into the Empty Homes partnership that Gillian also attends. So there was discussion in relation to how that might help in terms of empty homes, but also in relation to other derelict land. That group has the group met 3 times, and its work is complete, and a report has been prepared by the Land Commission and submitted to Government. It's been published. So I think following today's meeting, what I'll do is arrange for the link to that report to be circulated around the group. It's with Government just now, and in order to introduce compulsory service orders, it will require a primary legislation. So, obviously, as primary legislation, Government's committed to bring that forward within the Parliament, but that will take a significant time to do. That's why the report does say that it's not something that's going to happen immediately. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Are there any further questions? No. Okay. So we have 3 amendments and addendums, which I'm proposing to amalgamate and also add in a couple of points that have been made through this discussion. So what I was going to suggest is if I read out the proposed motion that I would put forward, and then obviously if people are not happy, they can still move their own amendments or addendums. But I'm hoping to try and find some consensus on this, because I think we're all coming at it from a fairly consistent position. So if you've got the coalition motion in front of you, I would leave that as it is, apart from at 1.2.6, I would add in and what costs may be recouped, to pick up on Councillor Munro's point about if there's additional costs to the public purse that could be recouped through that process. I would then add 1.2.7. So part of the Green amendment, which I would add in, the report will include examples of best practice throughout the UK, and look at improving communication and buy-in from staff, and consider the benefit of dedicated capacity focused on empty homes work. And the reason that I've kind of changed that from it will put in place dedicated capacity is we did have, I think we've had some responses around that, and also we did have a report in November which was looking at that question, which was quite, there was quite a lot of response in that, so I feel like that's partly been answered, but I'm not saying that we totally take that off the table, but I'm saying that's not necessarily the solution here. So if we keep that as an option, but we don't put into the report ensuring that there's dedicated capacity, because I think part of it is having that capacity across different teams. Do you want to ask a question, Councillor Burgess?
Sorry, I missed the wording of that.
So it would be a new part of the coalition motion. It would be 1.2.7, and it would read, the report will include examples of best practice throughout the UK, and look at improving communication and buy-in from staff, and consider the benefit of dedicated capacity focused on empty homes work.
So it can be more than one.
Is that on this point? Yep. Councillor Campbell.
Thank you, Convener. Hopefully it's a helpful suggestion. I understand that we are all trying to get our amendments and motions in much earlier these days. However, I think it's great that you're looking to find a consensus. Could I suggest that we maybe just get an email out with the final suggestion for the amendment, so we all have it on screen I think that would just help clarity, and it avoids any ambiguity about what is being suggested.
I think that's a good idea. If you're okay with me, I will... I've got that, Leslie. So I've got a couple more points that I'll read out verbally, just to make sure everyone thinks we're going in the right direction. Then we'll maybe take 2 or 3 minutes, send it out by email before we agree it. Okay. So the next point would be 1.2.8, which would be and includes an update on CSOs, on the compulsory sales orders, because I think that's there may be some update in the movement on the legislation, although it may not be that much. And 1.2.9 would committee will receive an annual report to update us on empty homes. So this report, it would come in January, it would cover all of these things, and then it would become an annual report that probably wouldn't have as much detail as the one this January, because it's answering a lot of questions, but it would be able to keep us updated on progress. So is everyone, I'm not asking for agreement, but in principle, minded to agree that, and then I'll get that typed and sent, and we'll just take a couple of minutes. Is that okay? Grand, thank you. Okay, I think everyone has now had a chance to read it. So it was just to see if people were minded to accept, or if they want to still move. No, okay. So that will be me formally proposing that amendment.
And I'll formally second.
Thank you. Agreed? Grand. Yeah, thank you, Leslie. Okay.
Under pressure to type.
Okay, so back to the minute now, I think.
Okay, thanks, Convener. So that takes us back on the agenda to item 4.1, which is the minute of the Housing and Economy Committee of the 7th of June 2018, and that's submitted for approval as a correct record.
Are there any questions, comments on the minute?
Yeah, are we approving it as a correct record?
Okay, can we... I think Councillor Cameron has a matter arising from the minutes.